You're listening to Little Green Cheese, episode 32. Well, hi there, everyone. I'm Gavin Weber, and this podcast is where you can learn about cheese making at home. Well, we've got a great topic to talk about today, and it's about cheese body defects. I'm going to talk about three main ones in particular, and that is if your cheese is too dry, whether it's too moist, or if it has mechanical holes. So firstly, we're going to talk about whether you have excessive moisture in your cheese. Now, this is pretty common, and it can be associated with semi-hard to hard cheeses, whether they're too moist. So what may happen? The texture of the cheese is too moist, and therefore it's too soft once mature. So some of the causes can be rennet, not using enough rennet at the start when you're trying to get your curds set. You'll find you'll have a sloppy curd, and therefore the cheese won't turn out to be how you like it. Now, some of the issues with that can be that you're using normal pasteurized and homogenized milk, and that you haven't added any calcium chloride. Now, calcium chloride adds soluble calcium back to the milk, and it allows the rennet to do its job, and that is set the curd properly. So some of the solutions for a current batch, if you find that you've got a sloppy curd, what you could do is drain it longer, use a close weave cloth instead of a normal loose weave cloth that you would otherwise use if you're making a semi-hard or hard cheese. Not too much you can do about it, except maybe turn it into ricotta and drain it that way. You'll also find that, So for future batches, if you find that, add just a little bit, maybe a milliliter of additional rennet, and I find that usually helps out. Or just make sure you've got the correct dosage of calcium chloride for that amount of milk. For 8 litres of milk, it's usually about 2 milliliters of calcium chloride. Now, if you found that your curd is not cut correctly, you've either cut it too large, which will result in a moister curd, or you haven't stirred it long enough and it still retains a lot of moisture in the curd. There's a couple of things you can do. You can cut the curd into a smaller size if you've got a curd cutter. Maybe a bit difficult. I noticed that sometimes when I have a bit of an issue, some of the curds down the bottom of the pot that I haven't managed to cut properly, I'll cut through those with the stainless steel spoon when I'm stirring. So I'll cut those in half as I go along, and maybe even in half again. So that way I'll get an even curd cut. And if I need to, if they're too large, then I'll just stir for a little bit longer, maybe another 30 minutes longer, depending on the size of the curd, of course. And then you'll find that a lot more whey will be expelled out of the curds. So another remedy for if your cheese is too moist, what you can do is you can lower the humidity in your aging facility, whether that be a basement or your converted cheese fridge. Just lower the humidity, but make sure that you don't lower it too quickly or too much, because then you'll find you'll get surface cracking. If you find that you've got too much moisture in your cheese after you've waxed it, and you find that there's a bit of moisture, or there may be some seepage or something like that, then what I've done in the past is I've taken the wax off, even though it's not quite mature, tipped the excess whey down the sink. I've patted the cheese with paper towel, making sure that I don't get any paper towel stuck on the cheese. And then I've re-waxed the cheese, getting rid of that excess whey. And 9 times out of 10, I've found that the cheese turns out very, very good, because it's not swimming in its own whey still, trapped under the cheese wax. Another problem that you'll find with your moisture too high in the final cheese is that you haven't pressed it hard enough. Inadequate pressing may result in excessive moisture, and that's held in the middle of the cheese. So what you're going to have to do is make sure that you follow your instructions and how long and for how heavy the weight needs to be onto the cheese. Now, we actually have a question later on in the show around pressing with a spring versus a continuous weight, so I'll leave that to there. So what you can do is, if you haven't pressed it properly, but you think the rind is okay and there's no holes and the curds all clump together okay, but it's just too moist. As I mentioned before, for the current batch, you can have a lower humidity. Make sure that you don't dehydrate it and cause cracking. For future batches, make sure that you use the right amount of pressure and the right amount of time, and you turn it when it says to turn it. Don't leave it for an extra long period, because the moisture will accumulate at the top and not the bottom. And make sure that when you are aging a cheese that you do rotate it, because that evenly distributes the fat molecules within the cheese, and you don't get moisture pooling at the bottom. With it sitting in the same place all the time, you'll find you get moisture build up as well. So also another point for moisture within your cheese, or excessive moisture, is that humidity in your cheese cave or your basement or wherever you're aging a cheese is just too high. So you'll have to lower the humidity, whether that be keeping your cheese in a ripening box. You could control the humidity that way, or simply dry the cheese out more often. All right, so that's if you've got body defects where your cheese is too moist. So if your cheese is too dry, which is the opposite, obviously. Now, this can happen with mainly renneted cheeses, so semi to hard cheeses. Doesn't happen very often with soft cheeses. So if the texture of the cheese is too dry from having a low moisture content, therefore it'll end up being too hard or too tough. One of the causes is adding too much rennet. Adding too much rennet usually results in too much whey being expelled from the curds during the stirring period of the cheese. Also, if you cut the curds too small, obviously you're going to get excessive whey expelled from the curds as well, so you'll need to cut those larger. It's pretty hard once you've cut them already. What you could do is stir less if you do cut your curds too small, therefore be making a drier cheese. If you have stirred excessively for too long or at a too high a temperature, you'll find that you get excessive whey coming out of the curds as well. So you'll have to reduce the time you stir it and make sure the temperature is spot on in your process. If the cheese is too acidic, so the pH is too low, you would have to, it makes a very dry and crumbly cheese. So you've got to watch your pH. You can either do that with litmus paper or test strips, or you can buy a device that measures pH. If you stick to most of the recipes and you time it specifically and you put the right amount of culture in, you don't have too many troubles. I rarely do have too many troubles with over acidic cheese. You'll soon know once it's ripened, the flavour is very, very sharp, and it's a very crumbly cheese. You'll know that's the issue. And finally, if your environment where you're ripening it is too dry, then obviously the cheese is going to dry out very rapidly. And we have a question around aging a Parmesan for a very long time and how to do that. So I'll answer that when we get to the questions. So what you can do with a poor environment is you can increase the humidity, or you can, if you want to have a natural rind, then you can oil the rind, or you can vacuum pack it, or you can wax the cheese, and that will maintain the moisture in there, and you shouldn't get too drier cheese. So that leads me on to mechanical defects. And I'll get a lot of questions about this. So this is mechanical holes within your cheese. There's a few ways, but the main issue is, and it doesn't matter how it gets infected, is that sanitation is usually the issue. If you don't sanitize your equipment before you make your cheese, then inevitably you're going to find that you may run into some of these issues. Now, what I mean by mechanical holes is that cheese may swell, it may bloat, it may leak lots of whey for no apparent reason whilst it looks like it's swelling. And this is swelling without adding in propionic shamani, which is the bacteria that they add to Swiss-style cheeses to make the holes, the eyes. So this is without the use of that. So some of the issues you can face is a yeast contamination. Now, yeast contaminations contaminate the curd during cheese making. They produce carbon dioxide gas, which obviously makes the holes in the cheese, makes it smelly. The cheese also feels a bit spongy. I remember that happening. And in extreme cases, I've had one of these extreme cases is that I had a Parmesan and it blew up and the entire center of the cheese was just one big bubble. Now, I figured that what the issue was there, and for most cheesemakers, you'll find the same issue, is that wild yeasts have contaminated the milk, or somebody has been making bread in the kitchen at the same time or within a few hours of you making cheese. So the yeast can infect the milk. Therefore, you should not make bread at the same time you are making the curds and forming your cheese, even if you are pressing cheese in the same space you are making bread. So that's yeast contamination. The other one is coliform contamination. Now, coliform is a bacteria that's found in the feces of animals, and it's contaminated the milk and therefore the curd. What it results in is usually a random, smallish type holes in the body of the cheese, which kind of looks like uneven pressing, and it has a bit of a sourish smell to it, like it's overripe. There's no solution for a current batch of cheese that you've made, but the solution is, as I mentioned before, better sanitization. Now, last but not least, there's what's known as butyric acid bacteria, or BAB. And these are this mainly grows around about 4 to 6 weeks of ripening. And what this can do is have from a slight to a massive eyes in your cheese. It has no specific off taste. However, it does taste very acidic. And you'll find there are a lot of holes or eyes in your cheese where normally you wouldn't want it. Now, this is usually caused by undersalting. So undersalting your cheeses, and especially for brine salted cheeses such as wash curd, they're particularly sensitive to late blowing, as it's known as well. BAB bacteria is also known as late blowing. And it's because the salt doesn't infuse all the way down to the interior of the cheese. You've got to make sure that you've got a high salt concentration in your brine, and you've got to leave it in there long enough that the salt's going to get all the way to the center. And without that high salt content, you're actually going to let the bacteria spores breed and multiply and therefore create big eyes in your cheese. What could be the cause of that? Well, as I mentioned, undersalting. Another cause is that your temperature was too high, or the pressure was too low, and of course undersalting. So the solution is to make sure that you press your cheese adequately for the right pressure and the right duration, and that you add the correct amount of salt. So there are 3 main defects that can occur to your cheese, whether it's too dry, too moist, or for some reason it gets mechanical holes. So hopefully that's enlightened you a little bit on some of the issues, and you should be able to troubleshoot that a little bit better going forward. So on with the news. Well, this week's news is from the cheese state in the US, Wisconsin. This one's in particularly from Madison, Wisconsin, and there was a bit of a hullabaloo around the the Food and Drug Administration not clarifying some rules about raw milk cheese being able to be aged on wooden boards. I've seen a fair bit of it in the press here in Australia. I don't think they have such an issue, but certainly over in the US. Now, I managed to pick this news story from, channel3000.com, which I think comes from Madison in Wisconsin. So I'm just going to play that for you now. It's a very interesting piece. It looks like that a cheesemaker called Andy Hatch will have to stop making a specific cheese. It's a Swiss-type cheese. And he's going to have to stop making it because of the possible rule change that may occur. I don't know if it's a knee-jerk reaction because I haven't seen too many other artisan cheesemakers have to stop. But anyway, have a listen to what Andy has to say.
Cheese with a cult following is a casualty of possible rule changes by the FDA. Good evening, I'm Michelle Lee.
And I'm Eric Franke. It's an issue that could affect many local cheesemakers and those who buy their products. News 3's Jess Garp has more on the latest regulation issue. Jess.
Well, the Dodgeville cheesemaker said his decision to stop making one popular cheese is a precautionary one, concerned that FDA rules on raw milk cheeses could change and put his business at risk. Just hours old Pleasant Ridge Reserve cheese will sit a bit longer in a press before hitting wood boards and heading to the cheese cave. But the Alpine-style cheese won't be joined by its creamier cousin this fall after a decision by cheesemaker Andy Hatch.
The decision not to make Rush Creek this year was not an easy one, and it was made over the last few months as the regulatory climate surrounding traditional cheeses has become cloudier and less clear.
Both Pleasant Ridge Reserve and Rush Creek are raw milk cheeses. Pleasant Ridge will sit in the cave for months, while Rush Creek is aged just 60 days, which is currently allowed under FDA rules. But the FDA is re-examining those rules, and after questions were also raised recently by the federal agency over using wood boards to age cheese, Hatch said he made a business decision.
To produce milk, tie it up in cheese is a financial risk, and when you don't know how that cheese is going to be treated by regulators, it's taking a big risk.
Food safety and regulation expert Marianne Smukowski says cheesemakers across the country met last week with the FDA in California in hopes of clearing up issues. But she says other raw milk cheesemakers have also pulled production.
It's obvious we need to talk to FDA again and see what we can do to have better communication and what we need to do.
Hatch admits Rush Creek has a cult following and hopes his decision isn't permanent.
Well, I feel a little bit like the Grinch. I'm getting emails, people are telling me they're going to have to cancel Christmas and wait for next year. We hope it'll be back.
Because Upland's Cheese uses all its own milk to make its cheese, they plan to simply sell off the fall and winter milk to another cheesemaker. It's unclear when the FDA plans to issue its new rules on raw milk cheeses, but Hatch said he won't consider making Rush Creek cheese again until they do.
Well, that's a shame. Sounds like a very nice, tasty cheese. So Rush Creek Reserve's not going to be made this year in Wisconsin. So, look, I'm glad that we as home cheese makers and curd nerds don't have that issue. We can ripen the cheese however we like. We can make the cheese in any style we like. If we want to, and it's up to us, we can make raw cheese, raw milk cheese anytime we like, any way we like. Obviously, we've got to make sure that we follow the right precautions insofar as sanitation, make sure the milk comes from clean cows, and there's not feces infection or contamination. We just got to make sure that we know that our milk comes from a reliable source. So we can make as many cheeses as we want, and we don't have to worry about whether we can mature them on wooden boards or not. You know. With that said, obviously you can't whip up a cheese business and start selling them. Make sure that you follow the food regulations in your country. I know here in Australia we have some issues with Raw milk cheese, there are specifics where you can and cannot use raw milk in cheese if you're going to sell it. There are a few places in Australia that do sell raw milk cheese, some down on Bruny Island in Tasmania. So, and other cheesemakers are starting to pick it up. But for home cheesemakers, the risk is yours and yours alone. And if you choose to share raw milk cheeses with your friends, that's your choice. I'm not going to tell you that you can or cannot. So now we're on to the listener questions. Now, I don't have any voicemails. Nobody called in this week, which is a shame because I do like the voicemail. So if you've got one, don't forget you can pop over to littlegreencheese.com over on the sidebar and record your voice message or your voice question. I don't mind which one it is. I'll play any of them. But yeah, just pop over there and record them through any microphone that you have on your computer. Now, we have 5 questions this week. So let me start off on these. So the first one's from Naomi. And Naomi comes from somewhere in Australia. And Naomi says, "Dear Gavin, I've listened to a few of your podcasts and your video instructions were instrumental in my 5-year-old daughter and I understanding how to make cheese and cut the curds." That is amazing. 5-year-old daughter has become a curd nerd. How good is that? We have made a block of Parmesan and have stored it in our unused sauna in the middle of the house. Temperature is about 12 degrees Celsius. I put it in a plastic box and had the lid on it for the first 2 weeks as I turned it, but was concerned about humidity. She's awaiting delivery for a temperature and humidity gauge. So put a moist cloth in the box and the mold grew, and so we cleaned the mold off. Now I have the lid and off the container and now the wet cloth. There's also lots of mold still growing on the cheese after cleaning it 2 days ago. Can you clear up my confusion? Number 1, do I need to keep cleaning the mold off the cheese, even if it is every day? Should I rub olive oil over it? Number 2, is the Parmesan okay in a milli cheese aging box? Not quite sure what you're talking about there, Naomi. I think you may be talking about a Mad Millie kit, maybe, which has a grate on the bottom. Should it be lid on or lid off? Thanks, we are so desperately wanting Parmesan to eat in 10 months' time. Signed, new cheesemaker, Naomi and daughter Kira, 5-year-old. Well, that'll have to be the loveliest little email from our youngest curd nerd ever. So, to answer your questions, Naomi and Kira, if the Parmesan keeps getting moldy, keep wiping it. So I would wipe it off with a brine and maybe a little bit of vinegar in the brine solution. If you're making the brine solution a fully saturated brine, you're going to have to put vinegar in it anyway. So it will dry out if you leave it unwaxed for the 10 to 12 months that it takes to age. So what I would do, and this will help with mold, controlling your mold as well, is that I would wipe it off first, make sure it's absolutely clean. Don't scrub it, but, absolutely clean. You should have a natural rind by now anyway. So I'd vac pack it if you've got that facility, or I would wax the cheese. So then you would be able to leave it in your little cheese box with the lid off. Certainly probably humid enough. Check with, hopefully you've got a hygrometer by now, and as long as it stays around about 80 to 85% relative humidity, you'll find that your Parmesan will taste absolutely delicious in 10 months' time. So hope that works out for you, and enjoy your cheese-making adventures with your 5-year-old daughter. That is just absolutely fantastic. I'm blown away by that. So thanks for your question, Naomi. The next question is from Wayne, and Wayne has a question. Wayne's been on the show before. He says, "Hi, Gavin, just pressing a kafili and was reminded about something that puzzles me. I used the 22 kilo spring to give me a rough idea of pressing weights, But is it all that important? I've noticed that when I press the spring to the desired level, the cheese naturally gives way and the spring then has a different tension. If I apply static weights on top, the weight would stay the same for the duration of the pressing. How do I rationalise this anomaly? Thanks again for all the work you put into this show. Cheers, Wayne. And Wayne's from the Northern Rivers, New South Wales. Well, Wayne, very simple solution, this one. I simply retighten the spring every few hours, especially if I'm pressing a cheese for a 12-hour stint. I'll pop back after a couple of hours and retighten it down to the level it needs to be. Now, if I have to retire for bed, I'll give it one final screw down and down to the right level. Now, by using this very simple method, I don't have any issues. I've never had any issues with a pressed cheese, especially no mechanical holes or anything, or the curd not sitting together, because I make sure that, as per the instructions, I press it lightly first, then turn it, then press it again, then turn it. And it depends on the recipe, of course, but I follow it exactly. And with the spring, as I said, as it starts to release its tension, what I basically do is wind it a bit tighter down to the required pressure. And I don't have any issues with it at all. Never had a problem, and it seems to work out fine. So, simple solution, Wayne, and thanks for your question. All right, the next question is from Soren. I think that's how you say it. I may get that wrong. Soren's from Denmark. Soren says, "Hi, Gavin. After 7 years of home brewing, I got the idea to make cheese. I started a week ago and I've made 3 cheeses, feta, blue cheese, and Caerphilly. Your webpage is really good and has been my primary source of information. I listened to your podcast on salt, and you mentioned that iodized salt cannot be used since it retards the cheese culture's use. Also, I've noticed that statement on other English language pages, but not on any Danish pages or resources like books or instructions. All salt in Denmark is iodized, except for the too expensive gourmet salt. The brand I've used in my house has 1.3 milligrams of potassium iodine per 100 grams of salt. Now, I've made sauerkraut several times using 25 grams of iodized salt to 1 kilo of cabbage with no starter culture, and 2 weeks later, lactic bacteria on the cabbage has turned it into sauerkraut. Being a home brewer, I know there is a ton of homebrew myths out there. Is iodized salt a cheesemaker's myth? I am just not patient enough and found out till my own iodized cheeses are ready. Cheers, Soren from Denmark." Well, Soren, thanks for your question, mate. Look, I don't think it's a cheesemaker's myth. All the research that I've looked at, potassium iodide does kill off bacteria. Case in point is when you find that iodine, when you dab it on a wound, that's the reason you dab it on a wound, is to kill bacteria. So that's a wound on your body. You know, you have a scratch or a cut. I remember when I was a kid, my mum, the first thing she'd do is break out the iodine and get a cotton ball out and shove it all over me, and I looked like a purple monkey. The point in case was it was to kill bacteria. So iodine certainly does, and iodized salt certainly kills bacteria, especially the ones in starter culture. So you may find in your cheeses, and you may not, depends on what you've done there, that your starter cultures may not have acidified the cheese correctly, and you won't get the flavour that you're hoping for. So to answer your question, no, it's not a cheesemaker's myth. Iodine in salt does kill bacteria. To what level, I'm not too sure, because I couldn't really find any other reference to it, but I do know that it is factual. So thanks very much, Soren, for your question. I hope your cheese turns out well. Don't forget to drop me back an email to let us know how it all went and whether it tastes cheesy or not, or whether the acidity's not very high. But let me know. That'd be fantastic, and then I can pass it on to all the other curd nerds out there. So the next one is from Murray Granger. And Murray's been on the show before. He's got 2 questions. First question is about aging. Now, Murray says, we have just made 8 litres of creamy white Stilton with cranberries. Oh, that sounds delicious. And indeed, Oh, and instead of using one large mold, we put the curds into 4 small molds. I dare say probably like camembert hoops, maybe, Murray. Does the size of the finished cheese affects the aging duration? Will a small cheese mature faster than a larger cheese? Well, to answer that question, Murray, I would say yes. Smaller cheeses that I've made do mature a little bit quicker, probably a month quicker. You would have to try them out. I would use a cheese trier if you've got one. Cheese trier is just a device you poke into your cheese. You can pull a bit out, taste it, and then put a plug back in there from the cheese that you've extracted. They're very handy little devices. I've never found the need to use one because I'm just happy with any cheese I make, basically. So, yes, the smaller one will mature faster, so just keep an eye on it. You'll have to taste it to figure out how fast it will mature. So, hope that answers that question. And the second question that Murray had was around waxing and turning. It says, once a cheese is waxed, is it still necessary to turn it regularly? This question references particularly your Emmental cheese recipe, which prescribes very regular turning. The answer to that question is yes, because when you turn it, the moisture is distributed evenly through the cheese and it doesn't allow the fat and the moisture to pool. If you find that you don't turn it regularly, especially when it's waxed, you will get whey or moisture accumulating inside the wax because you haven't turned it long enough. So it definitely is required. You need to turn your cheese, well, at least once a week. I do all of my cheeses once a week. Friday night when I get home from work, very first thing I do, it's a bit of a ritual. I go into the cheese cave and I just flip them over. It's about that easy, really. So, yeah, and that way I can keep an eye if any of the waxed ones that I've got start to swell for any reason, or I can see whey dripping out. It's just a good maintenance practice. You'll find that your cheeses will thank you for it. Now, Murray also sent me through a photo of all the cheeses in his cheese cave. So what I'll do, I'll pop that up into the show notes. That'll be fantastic. And you can see all the fabulous cheeses that Murray's got, some in ripening boxes and some that are waxed. And I'll put a label on the picture that says what type of cheese is what. Thanks very much for your question, Murray. Don't forget to keep writing in with those wonderful questions. And the last one is from Scott. And Scott sent me a question around, could he make a cheese stirrer? So a device that you put on top of the pot and it stirs the cheese. And I said, of course you can. You shouldn't have too many troubles there. So his question featured in episode 30 of the podcast, and you may remember that he said he had difficulty standing for long periods of time, so that's why he made the curd stirrer. Now he's done that, and he's sent through some pictures, and he's had a few issues with it of clumping. Now what I recommended was that, and you'll see in the photographs under the show notes for episode 32, that the paddle that he's using is a bit big. I've noticed some suggestions I have given Scott is that he could use wire, just like my curd cutter, which is featured in the show as well, that was sent through by David Dawson, my cheese friend over in Canada. You could use wire to stir and cut the curd at the same time, or a fairly thin sort of paddle, because if you have a large paddle on the bottom of your curd stirrer, you'll find that it clumps up a lot. Now, Scott did reply back to me and he said, you're absolutely right. This is the third paddle he's made and clumping has been a problem. He's going to try my suggestion of using a wire paddle or make something like that. When you see the pictures, you'll see that it's it does a 1 3/4 RPM, so it's very slow. He's also got a time relay on it, so he can set the time for how long it needs to be stirred. He said, I'm welcome to share this with other curd nerds with other people if you think it's useful to the other curd nerds who listen to the show. And he said, thanks for the wire tip. It didn't occur to me. He said, but he never claimed to be Thomas Edison. I reckon you're pretty cool there, Scott, because I haven't got around to making a curd stirrer yet, and yours looks pretty flash. He signs off, have a good day. Well, thanks very much, Scott. Fantastic. And I'll pop those photos up into the show notes. Anyway, that's all we got time for this week. If you're in the Melbourne area, there are cheese-making workshops held by yours truly. Pop over to littlegreencheese.com. You can find the link to the workshops there. Also, while you're there, have a look at my cheese-making ebook, Keep Calm and Make Cheese, the beginner's guide to cheese making at home. It's got all my recipes, and I'm in the process of writing a second edition to add some more recipes in there. That's in all ebook formats, including a PDF, which you can print out on your home printer. Also, while you're there, don't forget to have a look at my YouTube video tutorials. They're very helpful. So many people have said that they're fabulous, and they've helped them with their cheese-making endeavours. Thanks for listening, curd nerds, and stay tuned for the next exciting episode of the Little Green Cheese Podcast.